There are secrets that nations bury so deep they become myths. Whispers that echo through centuries dismissed as slander, as impossible rumors, as the desperate lies of political enemies. But what happens when the impossible becomes undeniable? When DNA doesn't lie, when historical records align perfectly like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. When the descendants of both the powerful and the powerless tell the same story across 200 years. In the rolling hills of Virginia, there stands a mansion called Monticello. Beautiful, iconic, a monument to American genius and enlightenment. But beneath its elegant columns and within its carefully preserved rooms, behind the gardens that Thomas Jefferson himself designed, there lived a secret so disturbing, so contradictory to everything its owner claimed to believe that it would take nearly 200 years for America to face the truth. A secret involving 38 years of silence, 6 children born into slavery who looked remarkably like the President of the United States, and a woman who had no power to say no. This is not a story about monsters or demons. This is something far more unsettling, far more real, far more human in its cruelty. This is a story about a man who wrote that all men are created equal while owning over 600 human beings throughout his lifetime. A man who publicly mourned his wife's death while privately continuing a relationship with her half-sister. A woman who had no legal rights, no voice, no choice. A man whose words shaped a nation and inspired revolutions around the world. While his actions revealed the darkest contradictions of his time and ours. Before we continue with the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by the dark, hidden corners of American history, by the secrets that shape this nation, by the contradictions that still haunt us today, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these stories reach. How many of us are ready to face the uncomfortable truths of our past? Now, let me take you back to a time when America was young, when the ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery existed side by side, when one man could write about freedom while denying it to the people closest to him. The year was 1772, and Thomas Jefferson was 29 years old when he married Martha Wales Skelton on New Year's Day. She was 23, a wealthy widow who had been married before for just 3 years before her first husband died. She was considered one of the most eligible women in Virginia, not just for her inheritance but for her beauty, her education, her refinement. She played the harpsichord with skill that impressed even the most cultured members of Virginia society. She spoke French. She had read extensively. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of woman a man like Thomas Jefferson would choose. And by all contemporary accounts, it was a love match. This was rare for the time when marriages among the Virginia gentry were often carefully calculated arrangements of property and alliance, where love was considered a pleasant bonus, but hardly necessary. Jefferson's friends noted how he doted on her, how they would play music together for hours, he on his violin and she on her harpsichord. They read to each other. They discussed philosophy and literature. They seemed genuinely happy. But Martha brought more than love and refinement to Monticello. When her father, John Wales, died in 1773, just over a year after her marriage to Jefferson, she inherited a substantial fortune, 11,000 acres of land, 135 enslaved people, and debts, enormous debts that would plague Jefferson for the rest of his life, debts he would never fully escape. Among those 135 enslaved people was a family called the Hemings. They were what was known in Virginia as bright mulattoes, people of mixed African and European ancestry whose skin was light enough that they could sometimes pass for white. The matriarch of the family was Elizabeth Hemings, a woman who had been born into slavery around 1735. Her mother, according to family oral history, was a full-blooded African woman who had been captured and brought to Virginia in chains. Her father was an English sea captain named Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings had 12 children. 6 of them, including a girl named Sally, were fathered by John Wales himself, Martha Jefferson's father, which meant that Sally Hemings, who came to Monticello as part of Martha's inheritance, was Martha's half-sister. They shared a father. They had grown up in the same household, though in vastly different circumstances. Martha in the main house, learning to play the harpsichord and speak French. Sally in the slave quarters, learning to serve and obey. Sally was 11 years old when she arrived at Monticello in 1773. Virginia, in the 1770s, was a place of stark and brutal contradictions. In the drawing rooms of plantation houses like Monticello, wealthy men in powdered wigs debated natural rights and the tyranny of kings. They read John Locke and discussed the social contract. They talked about liberty and the inherent dignity of man. And then they walked out of those drawing rooms and gave orders to human beings. They owned people who could be bought and sold and bred like livestock. People who had no legal rights whatsoever. The law was clear and absolute. Partus sequentrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. It didn't matter if your father was a plantation owner, a gentleman, a member of the House of Burgesses, even a future president. If your mother was enslaved, so were you. This law had been on the books in Virginia since 1662, specifically designed to ensure that the children of enslaved women remained enslaved, even when those children were fathered by white men, even when those children were the master's own sons and daughters. This legal principle meant that John Wales could father 6 children with Elizabeth Hemings and never acknowledge them as his own, never give them his name, never free them. They were his property. His daughters, yes, but also his property. And when he died, they became his legitimate daughter, Martha's property, which meant they became Thomas Jefferson's property. Think about what this meant for Martha Jefferson. She inherited her own half-siblings as slaves. She gave orders to her father's children by another woman. And she knew. She had to know. Everyone in Virginia society knew how these things worked. It was an open secret, something that was understood but never discussed in polite company. Thomas and Martha Jefferson's marriage was, by all contemporary accounts, deeply happy despite the financial pressures and the moral contradictions that surrounded them. They had 6 children together over the course of 10 years. A daughter, named Martha, called Patty, born in 1772. A son named Jane, who died at age 1. A son who lived only a few weeks and was never named. A daughter named Mary, called Polly, born in 1778. Another daughter named Lucy Elizabeth, who died at age 4 months, and another daughter, also named Lucy Elizabeth, born in 1782. But each pregnancy took a toll on Martha's health. She had never been robust. The repeated pregnancies, the births, the nursing, the grief of losing children, all of it weakened her progressively. By 1782, after the birth of her 6th child, it was clear that she was dying. The months of Martha's final illness were agonizing. Thomas Jefferson rarely left her bedside. Their daughter, Patty, who was 10 years old, later wrote that her father nursed her mother with a devotion so unremitting that even the servants were moved. He would sit with her for hours holding her hand, reading to her, trying to comfort her, as she grew weaker and weaker. In the slave quarters of Monticello, Sally Hemings was 20 years old. She worked in the main house, not in the fields. The Hemings family held privileged positions among the enslaved population at Monticello. Sally's older brothers, James and Robert, were being trained as artisans. James was learning to be a chef. Robert worked as a joiner and carpenter. Her mother, Elizabeth, essentially managed the household, supervising the other enslaved women, who cooked and cleaned and cared for the Jefferson children. But privilege is a relative term when you can be sold at any moment, when you have no legal rights, when your body is not your own, when your children will be born into the same bondage that holds you. The Hemings family may have had better food, better clothing, less physically demanding work than the field slaves, but they were still slaves. They could still be whipped. They could still be sold. They still had no legal recourse, no protection, no freedom. September 6, 1782. Martha Jefferson died at the age of 33, just 4 months after giving birth to her 6th child. The birth had devastated her already fragile health. For weeks she had lingered between life and death, growing weaker each day, while Thomas sat beside her bed and watched helplessly as the woman he loved slipped away. According to their daughter Patty, who was present during her mother's final hours, Martha made Thomas promise something before she died. The exact words were never recorded, but the family understood the meaning. Thomas Jefferson was never to remarry. He was never to bring another woman into Monticello as his wife, never to give his children a stepmother, never to replace her. Why did she extract this promise? Was it simply the fear of a dying woman that her children would be mistreated by a stepmother? Or did she know something, suspect something, fear something about what might happen after she was gone? Did she look at Sally Hemings, her own half-sister, and understand the vulnerability of an enslaved woman in a household without a white mistress to provide even the minimal protection that her presence offered? We will never know. But Thomas Jefferson gave his word and he kept it. He never remarried. For the remaining 44 years of his life, he remained a widower. Jefferson was shattered by Martha's death. For weeks afterward, he locked himself in his room. His daughter, Patty, later wrote that he was incessantly walking back and forth in his chamber, so lost in grief that he seemed almost mad. When he finally emerged, he would ride his horse for hours through the woods around Monticello in those melancholy rambles, as Patty described them, as if he could outrun his grief if he just rode far enough. His friends were worried about him. They had never seen him like this. Thomas Jefferson was known for his self-control, his rationality, his ability to master his emotions through reason and discipline. But Martha's death broke something in him. For months, he could barely function. He neglected his correspondence. He couldn't work. He couldn't write. He could barely eat. Finally, in 1783, his friends convinced him to accept an appointment as a trade commissioner to France. It would get him away from Monticello, away from the memories, away from the grief. It would give him something to focus on, a purpose, a reason to keep living. In 1784, he sailed for Paris, taking his eldest daughter, Patty, with him. His youngest surviving daughter, Polly, was left behind in Virginia with her aunt. She was only 6 years old, considered too young for the dangerous ocean voyage. Paris in the 1780s was a city of enlightenment and revolution, of salons and philosophers, of art and music and ideas that were reshaping the world. It was a city where the old order was beginning to crack, where people were questioning monarchy and aristocracy and the divine right of kings. It was a city that would within a few years explode into revolution. Thomas Jefferson thrived there. He moved in the highest circles of French society. He attended salons where the most brilliant minds of Europe debated philosophy and politics. He was admired as one of the architects of American independence, the author of the Declaration of Independence, a living symbol of the new republic across the Atlantic. He collected art and wine and books. He studied architecture and agriculture. He fell in love with French culture, French food, French ideas. He also, according to some historians, fell in love with a woman named Maria Causeway, a beautiful and talented artist who was married to a much older man. Their relationship, conducted through letters that still exist, was intense and emotional, though whether it was ever physically consummated remains a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that Jefferson was capable of deep romantic feeling, that he was not the cold, purely rational figure that some biographies have portrayed. For 3 years, Jefferson lived in Paris, serving as the American minister to France. He negotiated trade agreements. He sent back reports on European politics. He advised the French on their own revolutionary stirrings. and he tried to forget the grief that had nearly destroyed him. But in 1787, he decided it was time to send for his youngest daughter. Polly was 9 years old now, old enough for the voyage. He missed her. He wanted his family together. He arranged for her passage on a ship from Virginia to France. And because she was only 9 years old, because she needed someone to accompany her on the dangerous ocean voyage, someone to care for her and comfort her and keep her safe, someone was chosen for this task. Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old. Think about what this meant. A 14-year-old enslaved girl sent across the Atlantic Ocean with a 9-year-old child in her care to a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, where she knew no one except the man who legally owned her. The voyage took several weeks. The ship's captain, Andrew Ramsay, later noted in his records that Sally had taken excellent care of little Polly during the crossing. She had been gentle, patient, responsible beyond her years. She had comforted the child when she was frightened, by storms, had kept her clean and fed, had essentially served as her mother for the duration of the voyage. When they arrived in Paris in July 1787, something extraordinary happened. Sally Hemings discovered that under French law, she was free. Slavery was not legal in France. The principle was clear. Any enslaved person who set foot on French soil could claim their freedom. They could refuse to return to their master. They could walk away and build a new life. Sally Hemings could have been free. She could have stayed in Paris. She could have refused to return to Virginia. She could have claimed her freedom under French law, and there would have been nothing Thomas Jefferson could do about it legally. But she was 14 years old. She was alone in a foreign city. She didn't speak French. She had no money, no family, no resources, no way to support herself. And Thomas Jefferson was 44 years old, powerful, persuasive, sophisticated, the man who had been married to her half-sister, the man who legally owned her and her entire family back in Virginia. What happened next is where the historical record becomes murky, where we must read between the lines of letters and account books and later testimonies, where we must imagine what cannot be documented because enslaved people's lives were not considered worth documenting in detail. What we know for certain is this. Sally Hemings remained in Paris for more than 2 years. She lived in the same house as Thomas Jefferson and his daughters. She learned to speak French. She was paid wages, something that would never have happened in Virginia, where enslaved people received no compensation for their labor. The account books show regular payments to Sally for her services. She also, according to her son, Madison. Hemings' later testimony became pregnant during this time in Paris. She was 16 years old. Thomas Jefferson was 46. According to Madison Hemings, who gave an interview to an Ohio newspaper in 1873, his mother told him that she had been treated well in Paris, that Jefferson had made her certain promises. He promised that if she returned to Virginia with him, he would free all of their children when they reached the age of 21. He promised that they would be given special treatment, that they would be taught trades, that they would be prepared for freedom. But why would Sally Hemings agree to return to slavery? Why would she give up her freedom in France to go back to Virginia where she would once again be property, where her children would be born into bondage? Perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she believed his promises. Perhaps she felt she had no real choice, that a 14-year-old girl alone in Paris had no real prospects, that at least with Jefferson she would have security, protection, a place in the world. Perhaps she thought of her family back in Virginia, her mother and brothers and sisters who were still enslaved at Monticello, and knew that if she stayed in France she would never see them again. Or perhaps she simply had no power to refuse. Perhaps Jefferson made it clear that if she didn't return, her family would suffer. Perhaps the promises were accompanied by threats. Perhaps a 16-year-old enslaved girl pregnant with the child of one of the most powerful men in America understood that she had no real choice at all. We will never know what Sally Hemings truly thought or felt because she left no written record. Enslaved people were forbidden by law from learning to read and write in Virginia. Even if Sally had been literate, even if she had kept a diary or written letters, they would not have survived. The voices of enslaved people have been largely erased from the historical record, their stories told only through the accounts of others, their inner lives forever lost to us. What we know is that in October 1789, Thomas Jefferson returned to Virginia. Sally Hemings returned with him and she was pregnant. The child, a son, was born in 1790. He lived only a short time, but he was the first of 6 children that Sally Hemings would bear over the next 18 years. 6 children, all conceived during periods when Thomas Jefferson was documented to be at Monticello. 6 children who bore a striking resemblance to the President of the United States. The whispers began almost immediately. Monticello was not an isolated fortress. There were visitors constantly, neighbors, other plantation owners, politicians, scientists, artists, anyone who wanted to meet the famous Thomas Jefferson. There were overseers and hired workers who came and went. There were other enslaved, people who saw and remembered and talked among themselves. There were Jefferson's own legitimate grandchildren who grew up playing with children who looked remarkably like their grandfather. The resemblance was noted by many people. One visitor to Monticello wrote that Sally Hemings' children were white enough to pass for white and that they bore a striking resemblance to the president himself. Another visitor noted that one of Sally's sons looked so much like Jefferson that at some distance or in the dusk of evening he could be mistaken for the president. But in the world of Virginia plantation society, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't talk about these things openly. Everyone knew that white men fathered children with enslaved women. It was common, perhaps even expected, but it was not discussed in polite company. It was not acknowledged. The children of these unions remained enslaved, remained invisible, remained unacknowledged by their white fathers. Thomas Jefferson's situation was different only in degree, not in kind. He was more famous, more powerful, more publicly committed to ideals of liberty and equality. The contradiction between his words and his actions was more glaring, more impossible to ignore, but the basic pattern was the same as on thousands of other plantations across the South. In 1802, the whispers became public. A journalist named James Calendarer published an explosive allegation in the Richmond Recorder. Calendarer had once been an ally of Jefferson's, a political writer who had attacked Jefferson's enemies. But the two men had fallen out, and Calendarer was now determined to destroy Jefferson's reputation. The article was vicious, racist, designed to humiliate and shock. Callender claimed that President Jefferson kept a concubine at Monticello, as common as the pavement, a woman named Sally, and that she had borne him several children. He wrote that one of these children, a boy named Tom, was said to be the image of the president himself. The article caused a sensation. Jefferson's political enemies seized on it gleefully. His supporters were horrified and rushed to his defense. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, some repeating the allegations, others denouncing them as vicious lies. And Thomas Jefferson said nothing, not publicly, not ever. He never issued a denial. He never sued for liel. He never made any public statement about the allegations whatsoever. His silence was interpreted by his supporters as dignified refusal to engage with gutter journalism, as being above such base accusations. But his silence also meant that the accusations were never officially denied, never legally challenged, never definitively refuted. In private letters to close friends, Jefferson obliquely denied the allegations, but in such vague terms that historians have debated ever since exactly what he was denying. He never mentioned Sally Hemings by name. He never specifically addressed the question of whether he had fathered her children. His denials were carefully worded, ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. Why didn't he issue a clear, unequivocal denial if the allegations were false? Why didn't he defend his honor more vigorously? The most likely answer is that he couldn't. A clear denial would have been a lie, and Jefferson, for all his moral failings, seems to have been reluctant to lie outright. an ambiguous non-denial, allowed him to maintain his dignity without committing himself to a falsehood that could be proven wrong. Within Monticello itself, an elaborate system of discretion was maintained. Sally Hemings occupied a strange position in the household. She was never listed in Jefferson's farm books as working in the fields. She had no assigned duties that were recorded. She simply existed, present but invisible. Her role undefined and unacknowledged. Her children were given special privileges that set them apart from other enslaved children at Monticello. They were taught to read and write despite Virginia, laws that made it illegal to educate enslaved people. They were trained in valuable trades. Sally's daughter Harriet was taught to spin and weave. Her sons Beverly and Madison were trained as carpenters. Her youngest son, Eston, was taught to play the violin, just as his father had learned. These children were never sold, never sent to work in the fields, never subjected to the harsh discipline that other enslaved people at Monticello endured. They were, in effect, treated as Jefferson's children, even though he never acknowledged them as such. And when they came of age, they were allowed to leave. Beverly and Harriet simply walked away from Monticello in their early 20s, disappearing into white society, passing as white, building new lives where no one knew their origins. There were no formal manumission papers, no legal records of their freedom. They just left, and Jefferson let them go. This was extraordinary. Enslaved people who ran away were hunted down, captured, punished severely. Advertisements were placed in newspapers offering rewards for their return. But when Beverly and Harriet Hemings left Monticello, there were no advertisements, no pursuit, no punishment. They simply vanished into freedom with Jefferson's tacit permission. Jefferson's white family knew. They had to know. His daughter, Patty, now Martha Jefferson Randolph, lived at Monticello for much of her adult life with her husband and children. She managed the household. She supervised the enslaved people. She saw Sally Hemings every day. She saw the children who looked like her father, like her dead mother, like herself. What did she think? What did she feel? How did she reconcile the father she loved, the man who had been so devoted to her mother, with the reality of what was happening under her own roof? We have some clues. In letters to friends, Martha Jefferson Randolph occasionally made oblique references to the painful situation at Monticello, to things she wished were different but could not change. She never mentioned Sally Hemings by name, never explicitly. Acknowledged the relationship, but the pain and discomfort are evident between the lines. The family developed a code of silence that would last for generations. They didn't talk about Sally Hemings. They didn't acknowledge her children. They maintained the fiction that nothing unusual was happening, even as the evidence was literally walking around Monticello in front of them. One of Jefferson's grandsons, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, later provided an explanation that the family would cling to for nearly 200 years. He admitted that there was a general impression among the family that Sally Hemings' children were related to the Jefferson family, but he claimed it was actually Jefferson's nephew, Peter Carr, who was the father, or possibly Peter's brother, Samuel Carr. The story was vague, convenient, plausible enough to create doubt. This explanation had several advantages. It acknowledged the obvious physical resemblance between Sally's children and the Jefferson family, which was too striking to deny. But it deflected responsibility away from Thomas Jefferson himself, placing it on a younger relative who was less famous, less important, less of a threat to Jefferson's historical legacy. But there were problems with this explanation, problems that would become more apparent as historians examined the evidence more carefully. Peter and Samuel Carr were often away from Monticello during the periods when Sally Hemings conceived her children. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was always there. His meticulous records of his comings and goings preserved in his memorandum books showed that he was at Monticello 9 months before the birth of each of Sally Hemings's children. The timing was too perfect, too consistent, too damning. Moreover, Peter Carr himself, late in life, privately denied being the father of Sally Hemings' children. According to family accounts, he was angry that the story was being used to protect his uncle's reputation at the expense of his own. But the Carr explanation served its purpose. It created just enough doubt, just enough plausible deniability to allow Jefferson's defenders to maintain that the allegations were unproven, that there was no definitive evidence, that it was all speculation and rumor. As the years passed, the situation at Monticello became increasingly surreal. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the champion of liberty and natural rights, the man who had written that all men are created equal, was living with his enslaved mistress and their children while publicly maintaining the fiction that they didn't exist. He wrote eloquently about the evils of slavery, calling it a moral depravity and a hideous blot on America. In his notes on the state of Virginia, published in 1785, he had written, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He worried publicly about the judgment of God on a nation that enslaved other human beings. He proposed gradual emancipation plans, schemes for slowly ending slavery over generations. And yet he owned over 600 people during his lifetime. He bought and sold human beings. He separated families when financial necessity demanded it. He had people whipped when they disobeyed or tried to escape. And he freed only a handful of enslaved people in his will, all of them members of the Hemings family, all of them likely his own children or the siblings of his children. The contradiction was not lost on his contemporaries. Even his admirers were troubled by it. One visitor to Monticello noted the painful contrast between Jefferson's words and his actions, between the ideals he espoused and the reality of how he lived. But Jefferson seems to have been unable or unwilling to resolve this contradiction. He convinced himself that slavery was wrong in principle but necessary in practice, that it would end eventually but not in his lifetime, that he was trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He blamed the British for introducing slavery to America. He blamed the economics of plantation agriculture. He blamed Southern society. He blamed everyone and everything except himself. And all the while, Sally Hemings lived in her room in the South Dependency, bearing his children, raising them in the shadow of the great house, knowing that they would never be acknowledged, never be free until they reached adulthood, never have the rights and privileges that their white half-siblings took for granted. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. It was a coincidence so perfect, so symbolically powerful that it seemed almost providential. John Adams, Jefferson's old friend and rival, the other great surviving founder, died the same day. Adams' last words were reported to be, "Thomas, Jefferson survives." Not knowing that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier, Jefferson died at Monticello in his bed, surrounded by his white family, his legitimate descendants. He was 83 years old. He had been in declining health for years, suffering from a variety of ailments, struggling with the massive debts that had plagued him his entire adult life. His will was read shortly after his death. It freed 5 enslaved people. All of them were members of the Hemings family. 2 of them, Madison and Estston, were Sally Hemings' sons, Jefferson's sons. The other 3 were Sally's nephews, the sons of her brother, John Hemings. But Jefferson did not free Sally herself. Why not? The legal situation was complicated. Virginia law required that freed slaves leave the state within a year unless they received special permission from the legislature to remain. To get that permission, Jefferson would have had to petition the legislature publicly, explaining why this particular enslaved woman deserved to stay in Virginia. He would have had to acknowledge her, to explain their relationship, to make public what he had kept private for nearly 40 years. He couldn't do it or wouldn't. Even in death, even in his final act of freeing some of his enslaved people, he could not publicly acknowledge Sally Hemings. But he seems to have made arrangements with his daughter Martha. 2 years after Jefferson's death, Sally Hemings was quietly given her freedom. There was no formal manumission document, no legal record. Martha simply stopped claiming her as property. Sally was allowed to live as a free woman in Charlottesville, Virginia, near her sons Madison and Eston, who had been formally freed by Jefferson's will. She lived the last 9 years of her life in freedom, such as it was. She was in her 50s, no longer young, having spent nearly her entire life in slavery. She lived in a small house in Charlottesville, supported by her sons, who had both established themselves as skilled craftsmen. She never spoke publicly about her relationship with Thomas Jefferson. She never wrote a memoir, never gave an interview, never told her side of the story to any newspaper or historian. Her silence was absolute. Was it by choice? Was it because she had promised Jefferson she would never speak? Was it because she knew that no one would believe her, that she would be dismissed as a liar trying to profit from her association with a great man? Was it because the memories were too painful, too private, too complicated to share? We will never know. Sally Hemings died in 1835, 9 years after Jefferson, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Charlottesville. For more than a century and a half, her story would remain in the shadows, whispered about but never confirmed, acknowledged by some and vehemently denied by others. But her children remembered. They knew who their father was. They knew the truth. And some of them, particularly Madison Hemings, felt compelled to tell that truth. Even though they knew it would be controversial, even though they knew many, people would refuse to believe them. In 1873, 47 years after Jefferson's death, Madison Hemings gave an interview to an Ohio newspaper called the Pike County Republican. He was 68 years old, living in Ohio, where he had moved after gaining his freedom. He stated clearly and unequivocally that Thomas Jefferson was his father. He told the story of his mother's time in Paris, of how she had been free under French law, but had agreed to return to Virginia with Jefferson. He said that Jefferson had promised his mother that all of their children would be freed when they reached the age of 21, and that Jefferson had kept that promise. He described his childhood at Monticello, the special treatment he and his siblings had received, the education they had been given, the trades they had been taught. He described how his older siblings, Beverly and Harriet, had been allowed to leave Monticello and pass into white society. He described his own freedom granted by Jefferson's will and his life since then. The interview was detailed, specific, consistent with known facts about life at Monticello. It had the ring of truth, but it was largely ignored or dismissed by historians and the public. Madison Hemings was, after all, a former slave, a black man making extraordinary claims about one of the most revered figures in American history. Who would believe him over the word of Jefferson's white descendants, who continued to deny the relationship? The Heming family oral history was passed down through generations. Sally's descendants told their children and grandchildren that they were descended from Thomas Jefferson. They kept the story alive even when the rest of America refused to believe it. Even when historians dismissed it as myth or slander for more than a century and a half, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings remained in a strange historical limbo. It was widely known but officially denied. It was discussed in whispers but dismissed in textbooks. Historians debated it endlessly with passionate advocates on both sides. Some historians insisted it was true, pointing to the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the timing of Sally's pregnancies, the physical resemblance of her children to Jefferson, the special treatment they received, the fact that Jefferson freed them, Madison Hemings' testimony, the Heming family oral history. They argued that the evidence was too strong to ignore, that the denials were based more on a desire to protect Jefferson's reputation than on any real analysis of the facts. Other historians insisted it was false, a vicious slander against a great man. They pointed to the lack of definitive proof to the fact that Jefferson had never acknowledged the relationship to the Carr family explanation. They argued that it was impossible to prove that the evidence was circumstantial, that we should give Jefferson the benefit of the doubt. Some even suggested that the whole story had been invented by Jefferson's political enemies to destroy his reputation. Jefferson's white descendants maintained the family line for generations. It never happened. The resemblance was coincidental. The timing was misleading. The accusations were politically motivated lies. Peter Carr, or Samuel Carr, was the father, not Thomas Jefferson. The family closed ranks, protecting Jefferson's legacy, refusing to acknowledge what many of them must have known or at least suspected was true. But Sally Hemings' descendants knew the truth. They had always known. They passed down the story through generations, maintaining that they were the descendants of Thomas Jefferson, even when the rest of America refused to believe them, even when they were mocked or dismissed or accused of lying. The debate might have continued indefinitely, with both sides entrenched in their positions, if not for advances in science. In the 1990s, DNA testing became sophisticated enough to trace paternal lineages through the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son virtually unchanged through generations. In 1998, a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster organized a DNA study. He contacted descendants of Thomas Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson, who would have had the same Y chromosome as Thomas Jefferson since they shared a paternal grandfather. He also contacted descendants of Sally Hemings, Sally's youngest son, the one who had been born in 1808 when Jefferson was 65 years old. The results were published in the journal Nature in November 1998, nearly 200 years after Sally Hemings returned from Paris pregnant with Jefferson's child. The Y chromosome DNA of the Jefferson male line and the Hemings male line matched. They shared the same genetic markers. The probability that this was a coincidence was vanishingly small. Combined with the historical evidence, the timing of conceptions, the treatment of the Hemings family, the resemblance noted by contemporaries, the testimony of Madison Hemings, the DNA evidence was overwhelming. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which operates Monticello, commissioned its own study by a research committee of historians. In 2000, they issued their report. The weight of evidence indicated that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children. The impossible secret was true. After nearly 200 years of denial, debate, and controversy, the truth was finally acknowledged. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the 3rd President of the United States, one of the founding fathers of American democracy, had indeed fathered children with an enslaved woman. His wife's half-sister, a woman who had no legal power to refuse him. The revelation sent shockwaves through American society. For some, it confirmed what they had always believed. For others, it was a devastating blow to their image of Jefferson and the Founding Fathers. For the Heming descendants, it was vindication after generations of being dismissed and disbelieved. But here's what makes this story so deeply disturbing, so difficult to process, even now, so impossible to reduce to a simple narrative of villain or victimhood. We will never know what Sally Hemings truly felt. We will never know if she loved him, hated him, felt trapped by him, or found some measure of happiness, or at least acceptance in their relationship. We will never know because she was enslaved. And enslaved people's feelings didn't matter in the eyes of the law. She couldn't refuse him. She couldn't leave him. She had no power, no choice, no voice that was recorded or preserved. Modern discussions of the relationship often use the word rape because of this fundamental power imbalance. How can there be consent when one person owns the other? How can there be a real relationship when one person has all the power and the other has none? Even if Sally Hemings had feelings for Jefferson, even if she found some measure of happiness, With him, the relationship was fundamentally coercive because she was enslaved. But we also have to be careful not to reduce Sally Hemings to a mere victim with no agency whatsoever. She made choices within the extremely limited options available to her. She chose to return from Paris, perhaps because she believed Jefferson's promises, perhaps because she had no real alternative. She negotiated what she could for her children. She survived. She endured. She raised 6 children in impossible circumstances and lived to see some of them gain their freedom. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words changed the world. They inspired revolutions. They shaped the American experiment in democracy. They articulated ideals that America is still struggling to live up to more than 200 years later. But Jefferson denied those rights to Sally Hemings. He denied them to his own children with her. He built a nation on principles he couldn't or wouldn't apply to the people he claimed to own. He lived a life of profound moral contradiction, unable to reconcile his ideals with his actions, his words with his deeds. This contradiction was not unique to Jefferson. It was woven into the fabric of America from the very beginning. The same men who wrote about liberty and equality owned slaves. The same document that proclaimed all men are created equal was written in a nation where one-tenth of the population was enslaved. The same revolution that was fought for freedom left slavery intact and even strengthened it. Understanding Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings forces us to confront these contradictions, to grapple with the complexity and moral failures of the founding generation, to acknowledge that the men who created America were deeply flawed human beings who did great things and terrible things, often simultaneously. Monticello still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. For most of its history as a museum, Sally Hemings was barely mentioned. Tours focused on Jefferson's genius, his inventions, his architecture, his books, his wine collection. The enslaved people who made his lifestyle possible were largely invisible. But that has changed. In recent years, Monticello has made a concerted effort to tell the full story, including the story of Sally Hemings and the Hemings family. In 2018, an exhibition called The Life of Sally Hemings opened at Monticello, the first exhibition ever dedicated to her life. Her room in the South Dependency has been restored and is now part of the tour. Her children are acknowledged. The Hemings family is finally being written back into the history of Monticello, into the history of Thomas Jefferson, into the history of America. Descendants of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson have held reunions at Monticello, Black and white descendants meeting, acknowledging their shared ancestry, trying to build connections across the racial divide that has separated them for 200 years. It's a powerful symbol of reconciliation, of facing difficult truths, of trying to heal old wounds. But the questions remain. How do we reconcile the man who wrote some of the most beautiful words about freedom in the English language with the man who kept his own children in slavery? How do we honor the ideals he articulated while acknowledging the profound moral failures of his personal life? How do we tell the story of America's founding without flinching from the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the deep and terrible wrongs that were woven into the fabric of the nation from the very beginning? These are not easy questions. They don't have simple answers. Different people will answer them differently based on their own values, their own understanding of history, their own sense of how we should judge people who lived in very different times with very different moral frameworks. But they are questions we must ask, must continue to ask if we are to understand not just Thomas Jefferson, but the nation he helped to create. We must be able to hold two truths in our minds simultaneously: that Jefferson was a brilliant thinker, who articulated ideals that changed the world, and that he was a deeply flawed man who failed to live up to those ideals in his own life. that the Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents in human history, and that it was written by a man who owned slaves, that America was founded on principles of liberty and equality, and that those principles were denied to millions of people from the very beginning. The story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is not just their story. It's America's story. It's a story about power and powerlessness, about freedom and slavery, about the ideals we proclaim and the realities we live with, about the contradictions we carry and the truths we try to hide. It's a story that took 200 years to fully acknowledge, and we're still grappling with its implications today. This mystery shows us that the most disturbing secrets are often the ones hiding in plain sight, the ones that everyone knows, but no one wants to acknowledge, the ones that challenge our most cherished beliefs about ourselves and our history. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? How should we remember Thomas Jefferson now knowing what we know? Can we separate his ideas from his actions, or are they inextricably linked? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about the hidden darkness in American history, the uncomfortable truths that shape this nation, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries and isn't afraid to face difficult truths. See you in the next